Apartment living can be either a blessing or a curse. I am a single male in my 30s, recently out of a relationship. I was on a time crunch due to the fact that the lease on my old, spacious apartment was about to be up, and I had yet to find a new place. I was not really concerned with the area or the price due to the fact that I make a decent living. Being a typical lazy guy, I dreaded going on tours of empty apartments and having to cold call complexes. I went on a website and did a search. The first apartment on the listing was a 1-bedroom, 1-bath for under $850. I sent an email expressing my interest. No less than 10 minutes later, my phone rang. The voice on the phone told me the requirements, and in less than 10 minutes, I had agreed to stop by to reserve the apartment. I ended up moving in a few weeks later. It wasn't much to write home about. A pretty basic unit, smelled like paint and bug spray. I lit a scented candle and made my way to the bedroom to unpack. As I was hanging my art on the wall, I noticed some strange patches on the drywall. Some of these were small, about 3 inches round. The biggest was the fist-sized patch in the walk-in closet. The thing that got me questioning the safety of the apartment was the door frame. It had been replaced, as if it had been kicked in. I took pictures to show the landlord as proof of pre-existing damage. After a while, the smell of paint started to get to me. I walked into the kitchen to move the candle in order to spread the fragrance throughout the apartment. The candle on the counter was out. I found this to be odd since I was not near a window. I lit it again and returned to the bedroom with said candle. I froze as I entered the room. The box I had been unpacking was on its side and the contents were all over the place. I have a very active imagination and tend to overreact. Taking a minute to pause the music from my phone, I came to the conclusion that the box was unstable and I didn't hear it fall due to my headphones. I shook the thought from mind and continued my unpacking. The following weeks were pretty quiet. I would go to work early, come home late, watch TV, and go to bed. I had a friend and his service dog over for a few drinks. His dog usually sits at his feet and stays pretty quiet, but not this night. It kept pacing between the living room and the hallway, growling as it neared the room. My friend said this was unusual and that he had to leave. That night, I woke up at 2 a.m. to use the bathroom. On my way back, I walked past the closet, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw him. He was a young male in boxer briefs. He had his back to me, and he was bent over a duffel bag. I could hear him talking to himself and listening as if he was conversing with another person. I slammed the door to the walk-in closet and asked Siri to call 911 as I ran out of the apartment. The first unit arrived with lights and sirens. The officers made contact with me and asked if the suspect was still in the apartment and if he was armed. I told the officers that I wasn't sure. Then they proceeded into the apartment with their guns drawn. I heard them announce themselves as they conducted their search. A few minutes later, they came out with weapons holstered. The first officer said that no one was in there and asked me how much I had to drink since he noticed the beer cans from the previous night in the kitchen trash. I told him that I had consumed a few, but I wasn't even buzzed. He mumbled to himself and said his partner would take down a few details for the police report. His partner asked me the basics. He looked back at his partner, whom was back inside the cruiser with the door shut. Turning off his body cam, he asked me what I knew about the unit I was renting and how long my lease was. I told him the length of my lease and that I didn't know much about the history of the place. He sighed and told me that 6 months ago, the police had responded to reports of an armed tenant. The neighbors had called in about his strange actions and threats. When the police arrived, he had barricaded himself in the bedroom and was armed. They attempted to talk him down, but he began firing out the window. They had no choice but to kick in the bedroom door and put him down. I watched the officer in silence as he finished his tale. Before turning on his body cam, he asked me if I was religious. I responded that I was Catholic. He nodded and recommended that I get a priest to bless the apartment and to go get some sage. I thanked him and he walked back to the cruiser. In the morning, I will be contacting the local parish and going to purchase some sage. In the meantime, I will be napping in my car. The thunder outside my third-hour class was soothing. It was close to spring break, so we were just watching a Disney or Pixar movie. I can't remember which company made it. It was WALL-E. Nobody was paying attention, either sleeping or on their phones. Heck, even the teacher was on his phone. The rain began coming down harder. I was seated by the window, and all I was doing was watching the rain. April storms like this were common where I lived, so it was nothing out of the ordinary. The bell rang to let us out of third hour and go to lunch. In my school, you can go outside during lunch period and you don't have to eat. It can be cool when you just aren't hungry. Of course, like usual, there were some of those kids, you know the ones, that thought it would be funny to go outside and get soaked. I checked my phone while eating, so I didn't notice that they hadn't come back at all during lunch. I got a weather alert on my phone that we were under a tornado watch. Looking outside, it seemed about right. When the bell rang, I tossed my tray and headed to PE. The kids who had gone outside were supposed to be in that class. However, when the teacher did roll call, all 3 that had gone outside were absent. A couple of us were confused, because we had seen them go outside. One kid spoke up to say that she'd seen them during lunch. The teacher sighed and pressed a button to talk to the office. "Hello?" The voice rang out over the speaker. "Yeah, are Ethan, Luke, and Nate inside? My students said they were just a couple minutes ago." There was a silence over the intercom. We all stood around awkwardly, wondering when we were going to play Capture the Flag. The voice came back over the intercom again after a couple seconds. "And they're not with you?" "No, they're not here." We heard the intercom hang up after that. The teacher assumes that the kids were running around in the halls and that the office staff had to try to find them. We started Capture the Flag, and it usually only takes 2 rounds of the game before the bell rings and we have to go. However, the bell didn't ring. We ended up playing a 3rd round before we realized something was wrong. Our attention snapped to the clock, which was 13 minutes after the class was supposed to end. Just as we were preparing to leave, the intercom rang out. "Attention teachers, keep your students in your class until further notice." My stomach sank. I was always a nervous kid. This made me nervous like many other things do. The teacher looked confused for a second before switching the game to Martian tag. We played for a while before getting tired. He conceded and put on a movie for us to watch, Space Jam. A couple minutes in and we heard a blood-freezing shriek from outside the classroom. The teacher naturally got up to investigate, and all of us were staring at the door in fear, wondering what could have made that noise. A kid I didn't know too well, Kai, snuck over to the door to look out of the small windows. He stared for a couple seconds before pushing the door open and leaving. I had no idea what to do, but after 3 other students did the same, I freaked out. Everyone in the room was starting to wonder what was happening, so we made our way to the door, all 14 of us left, and we peeked out the window. It was just the empty hallway. It was still raining outside, and it was getting unnaturally loud. "Well, I'm going home," a kid said before pushing us out of the way and leaving the gym. I wanted to get out of there at that point too. Slowly, everyone filed out of the gym and went off in different directions. All I had on me was my phone, but that was the only important thing I brought to school. I decided to just head straight for the exit, as did one other person, Max. He was annoying, but in a way that makes everyone happier. It's hard to explain. We didn't talk much as we rushed for the front exit. When we did make it, the office next to it was abandoned. Nobody was in sight, and the lights were off. We looked outside into the rain, and we weren't able to see anything at all. It was raining way too hard. I decided to wait until the rain slowed before I left. However, Max did not share the same line of thought. He opened the door and walked into the rain. I checked my phone, and like you'd expect, there was no service. I put it back into my pocket because I didn't have the password to the school Wi-Fi. I didn't have any idea what to do while waiting for the rain to stop, so I wandered the hall. When I got into the area that had the 6th grade classes, I saw someone dart into a room. Faster than I could believe. You know how your vision clouds when you see something extremely startling? I hesitated in the hall, wondering if it was just a scared kid or what. I slowly made my way over to the door that it went into. Like many classroom doors, it had the tall and narrow window with wires in it. Peeking into the window, I saw a student crouched in a corner, sobbing. I slowly opened the door, and he immediately looked to the door. The fear on his face is still burned into my memory. He ran over to me and hugged me. Based on his size, I'd assume he was in 6th grade. After less than a second, he let go of me, realizing what he had done. I'm sorry, it's just that I don't know where anybody else is, and there's something scary in the halls, he said through tears, sniffling every couple of seconds. I felt sorrow while looking at him. I decided that I'd make sure he gets out alive as well. Listen to me. We're gonna get out of this all right. I'll protect you until the storm's over. He calmed down a bit and nodded. I looked around outside of the classroom, wondering what he meant by something scary. I thought maybe it was what made that horrible shriek earlier. I led him out of the classroom and I wandered the halls once again. The silence was deafening. I started to panic, wondering what happened to the rest of the students. As I rounded a corner, I saw what I'm sure the kid was referring to when he mentioned something scary. I quickly ducked back, holding my breath. The kid, who had told me his name was Junior, was hiding behind me. I heard the footsteps of whatever it was that was in the hall. It was opening doors and looking inside. I was in the 7th grade hall at the moment. As it opened a door, I heard someone scream and then that hideous shriek that the monster made. I had ducked behind the corner too fast to have gotten a good look at it. The scream coming from the poor person in that room was quickly silenced, after which the scream was replaced with the sound of meaty crunching. The hallway I was in had a window to the outside. The rain had definitely slowed down, but I wasn't going to risk what was in the rain. I went back the other way. I forgot to mention, but at this point the power in the school was off, and the light inside was dim as well. If there weren't windows, then it was pitch black. I rounded another corner and found myself staring down a black hallway. Under any other circumstances, I would have avoided it, but I heard the monster a ways back and it was getting closer. I slowly made my way down the hallway. I grabbed the hand of Junior as to not lose where he was. I was in the parking lot, where it had to be a dozen police cars and ambulances waiting. EMTs ran over to me when they saw me. From that point to the hospital, it was a blur. My parents, police, government agents, I got asked questions from everybody that knew about what happened. In the end, I got no answers. All I knew was that 112 people were missing. I never knew what came of the monster or what happened to the people who disappeared in the rain. I left the town soon after, and now I live in southern Indiana. This was 4 years ago. I recently graduated high school, and I tried to find out if the event was recorded online in some way or another. I couldn't find anything about it. No obituaries, no nothing. Anytime it rains now, I always get scared. My only hope is that whatever that monster was, it didn't escape. It started because I was doing a fluff piece on the new East Wing opening at the Habitsville Hospital. A hospital is a busy place, and the nurse who was showing me around the new area was quickly pulled away to more important matters. I was left to wonder, little red notebook in hand, jotting down details about the added infrastructure. Then I heard it, the familiar titter of low voices talking quickly and quietly, the distinct sounds of little-known and scandalous information being shared. Being the investigative reporter that I am, my ears pricked at the prospect of a story. The speakers were 2 doctors, both looking stressed in their white lab coats. They were both holding clipboards in their hands, with papers full of numbers I didn't have the education to understand. "I just don't know what's happening," one said. The other looked down at the chart. Unexplained paralysis, blood stoppages to the appendages, renal failure, heart failure. She shook her head. I've never seen anything like it. They held a solemn pause. Then the first doctor spoke. What are we going to tell the families? The other sighed. Just say we're doing everything we can. Then, straightening up, she cleared her throat. I'm going to go check on them, see if there's any more tests we can run. The two split ways, the doctor moving in the opposite direction, but the other walking towards me. I quickly averted my eyes so she didn't suspect my eavesdropping, but when she moved past me, I turned to follow her. She moved fast, like all the doctors I'd seen on those cheesy medical dramas. I kept up, walking at a safe distance behind until she reached her destination, the farthest collection of the hospital rooms within the new East Wing. There was a large desk in the corner of the semicircle, but no one was sitting at it. In fact, there seemed to be no other employees in the vicinity at all, so I stopped following the doctor so she wouldn't hear my footsteps accompanying hers. At first, I thought it was just another empty area, the same as the others in the new section of the hospital. But then, as the sound of the doctor's feet grew distant and disappeared, I took my first tentative steps forward and I saw them. Every room had an occupant. The doctor had said she was checking on them, so I could only assume she had stopped in one of these rooms. The awkwardness of getting caught was tempting me to turn back, but there was something else, something stronger that made me stay. As I peeked into each room, I could see them, citizens of Habitsville, laying in hospital beds, completely still. Not just still, no. It was as though they were frozen. An old woman, a middle-aged man, even a little girl. I watched each of them for about a minute at a time, and none of them so much as blinked. Their faces were gone and fixed in a permanent look of vacancy. I could hear a strange sound, a soft whistling coming from most of the rooms, and it took me a moment to realize what it was. The strenuous sound of someone trying to breathe without their chest rising and falling. I leaned into one of the last rooms in the semicircle and immediately pulled back. The doctor was in there, adjusting the medical equipment around the bed of a woman. I don't think she saw me, but immediately cursed myself when I heard her speak. Hello? I entertained the idea of fleeing the scene, but instead walked into the doorframe. Hi, She glanced at the visitor sticker I wore on my collar. You're here to see Michelle? She asked, motioning to the woman who lay in the bed. I hesitated. Yes. I haven't seen you around, but she had said she had a nephew. We both looked at the woman, ashen and frozen in the bed. I mean, when she could still... The doctor said awkwardly, then trailed off. She looked at me and gave me a tired smile. I'll give you two a moment alone. Then she left. I looked out the door to see the doctor make her way over to the large desk in the center of the area. It would be incredibly suspicious if I were to immediately walk back out of the hospital room, so I supposed I was indeed going to have a moment alone with Michelle. She was different than the others. She was dressed in the same drab hospital gown, her blonde hair set flat and lifeless against her head, and her face had that same frozen, vacant expression. But I quickly saw something that made my heart jump in my chest. Her eyes were following me. While the others couldn't so much as blink, Michelle was staring at me intently. It seemed insensitive to be scared, but my hands grew slick with sweat and my pulse quickened. It was like looking into the eyes of a deer that had just been hit by a car. Hi, I said nervously, but of course she didn't answer. Her eyes were flickering, moving from meeting mine to something to the right. What is it? I asked, knowing that it was useless. Her lips were glued shut, just like the others, though her chest still rose for each breath with obvious effort. Then I saw her hand. Her arms were stuck at her side, but I could see the tiniest bit of movement in her fingertips. It was motioning clumsily somewhere on the other side of her bed. Cautiously, with another quick glance out of the room to make sure the doctor was still at the desk, I made my way to the other side of her bed. My anxiety waned slightly when I saw it was something completely ordinary. Her handbag. "You need your purse?" I asked, slightly embarrassed at my nervousness. I picked it up and brought it over to her. Her hand moved faster in a beckoning motion. "You want me to get you something out of it?" She blinked more rapidly and moved her hand faster, which I took as a yes. I opened the purse. Inside were all of the normal things. "You need your wallet?" She didn't blink. "Lipstick?" Again, no blink. "Hairbrush?" Nothing. There was a keychain attached to a small picture of Michelle, looking much healthier, and a grinning little girl. Still, this elicited no response. Then, I saw it. It was a small vial, almost like a test tube. I thought it might be some kind of medication, and I considered calling the doctor or a nurse. Then, I saw the label. It was a plain piece of masking tape stuck to the glass on the outside. In large block letters, drawn on with a shaky hand, was a single, unexpected word: fox breath. I pulled it out of her purse and turned it over in my hands. The contents were strange. It looked like dirt, a chalky reddish brown. It fell grain by grain as I turned it, my eyes transfixed. It took me a moment to realize that Michelle was now blinking very fast at me, faster than she had any of the previous times. I tried to hand it to her, and her finger moved in a circle, in a message I took to mean unscrew the cap. I did so, peering with one eye into the opening. I had no idea what this ill woman wanted with a bottle of dirt, but as her pretend nephew, I wasn't going to deny her. She twitched her finger more, so I brought the vial close to it. Slowly, painstakingly, her breath growing more ragged and labored, she stuck her pointer finger into the bottle and curled it, and brought out a small collection of the dust. With great effort, she flipped it onto her palm, then went in and did the same thing again. Now there was a small mountain of the stuff in the center of her hand. She stopped moving. Then, with a low growl coming from within her stuck-closed mouth, her arm bent at the elbow. With a great amount of strength and pain, she was able to lift her hand to her face. I thought for a moment she might eat the dust, which would have been bizarre, but she froze, catching her breath. Her lungs had begun to make that same whistling sound that the other had, the strange hum that resonated in the east wing. Then, with the smallest movement, she beckoned me closer. I hesitated. Her eyes were watering from the effort it took to move even that small amount, but there was something more within them. Though it seemed she was unable to move her facial muscles, even her eyebrows, there was something intensely pleading in the way she was looking at me. So, unable to say no, I leaned forward. Still staring at me, her eyeballs frozen in their sockets, I heard something strange. The whistling of her breathing had changed, growing strangely deeper, a great hollow sound that almost made me take a step back. Almost. And then, in a sharp, high-pitched gust, she blew air out of her nose as hard as she could, coating my face in the strange dirt in her hand. I immediately fell backward, coughing and spluttering. My mouth tasted of salt and chalk, and my eyes were stinging and clouded. "What the?" I started to say, but I still didn't want to attract the doctor's suspicion, so I fell silent. I rubbed my eyes, staring at the floor. Once they cleared, I turned back to Michelle to ask her questions that I knew she couldn't answer. But when I looked at the woman in the hospital bed, I found her drastically changed. I blinked, trying to see if the dust had simply messed up my vision, but there was no mistaking it. Though the top half of her face remained as I had previously saw it, everything else was disturbingly different. From her mouth down, her skin was a strange reddish brown, not like any human skin tone I'd ever seen. But the color wasn't the worst part. No, the texture was what caused me to violently recoil. I could see that her chest and neck had a sort of shine to it, glistening under the harsh fluorescence as though the skin was permanently wet. The lower half of her right arm was the same, slick and horrific, bits of it smearing on the blanket that covered her lower half. I could only imagine what her legs looked like. But the top half of her right arm, her left arm, and the lower half of her face were different from the rest. They were light in color and lacked the shine. In fact, they seemed incredibly hard and dry. I could see that there were even cracks in her skin around her elbow, where she had raised her arm to blow dirt into my face. I backed away slightly. I was going insane, clearly. This woman was insane, or murderous, or mad from illness, and she made me inhale some sort of powdered drug that made me hallucinate. Right? Michelle was still staring at me, her ordinary skin peeking above the rest like a masquerade mask. Her eyes held mine with that same pleading expression, but this time I had no idea what she wanted, what she expected me to do about her plight. Then, something even worse happened. Her breath caught in her chest, a rattle there. "What's wrong?" I asked quickly, but of course she couldn't answer. As I watched in horror, the skin of her chest changed. Though it was glistening and wet before, it had begun to dry. Michelle was silently coughing now, wheezing through her nose, her mouth still stuck shut. As her chest hardened, she seemed to grow even more in distress, thrashing with what little movement her body would allow. I moved to her bedside, tried to loosen the collar of her gown, but then immediately had to pull my hand back in pain. Her chest, which was still growing more and more dry and dusty, had been white hot to the touch. I was panicking now. I'm getting the doctor," I said, then felt a tight pressure on my wrist. Michelle's still moist right hand was gripped tightly on my skin, the slick wet texture of her touch sending a shiver down my spine. Her strange fingers had left marks of reddish brown on my skin. The top half of her face was turning now, the color shifting to the same as the dust in the vial, which was clasped firmly in my hand. Her eyes traveled to it, then back to mine, the same yearning in her face. I could feel her hand hardening around my wrist, and watched as the same happened to the rest of her chest and face. She wasn't blinking anymore, her eyes murky with the substance that had become her body. As her grip hardened and dried, I felt another surge of pain. It was growing hot, same as her chest. I quickly grew past warm to uncomfortable to actually burning my skin. I tried to yank my arm away as my flesh baked and blistered, but Michelle didn't loosen her fingers. I shut my eyes and pulled as hard as I could. Crack. I tentatively opened them and my heart dropped into my stomach. Michelle had shattered, a pile of dusty rubble sitting in her hospital gown. I distantly heard the ringing of flatline and left quietly as doctors came rushing in. I moved past the rest of the rooms in the east wing, looking in as I had the first time, but now I could see them. Clay figure after clay figure, each hardened into rigid casings. I left the hospital, one hand wrapped tightly around the vial that read "Fox Breath," the other still bleeding and burning from the touch of the dead woman's grasp. I took a walk around town. It's something I always do when I've seen something I wish I hadn't, something terrifying and confusing and impossible. I craved the feeling of fresh air after watching Michelle suffocate before she disintegrated is the best way I could describe it. I had so many questions. Why couldn't the doctors see what was going on? The cruel creeping of the clay, the strange intense heat of it. Why couldn't I at first, until Michelle blew the dust into my eyes? I kept walking, my fist still closed around the fox breath vial. My feet continued to wander as my mind did, and by the time I looked up, I was in an unfamiliar part of Habitsville. It was one of the many dusty back streets in town, the few buildings boarded up and dark, the streetlights flickering in the coming dusk. I took one step back to turn around and head home when I saw it. Fox Breath Pottery. It just couldn't have been a coincidence. I stared at it for a moment, making sure I hadn't imagined the faded text on the age sign. It was a small building, tucked between two abandoned ones, but still, it stood out. There was a faint light dancing in the clouded window. I walked closer, creeping carefully until I was near the window. I didn't dare approach the door. The glass was coated in red dust. It was difficult to see through, but at the bottom near the worn sill I found a gap in the layer of dirt and was able to see inside. There was an old man inside, and for a moment I feared he too had the same ailment as the people I had seen in the hospital. Then I realized his hands were only covered in wet red clay, and his fingers still moved with ease, unhardened. I couldn't see his face, only the glint of his wired glasses and the hunch of his back. He was seated at a long wooden table on which there were a few objects. A large square wrapped in cheesecloth, a bit of wet clay visible through the fabric. Tools, dainty scrapers and cutting wire, all coated in red dust. Then there were the figurines. A few were painted. They were glossy and sturdy finished products. And then there were the unpainted, the unfinished. A man, an old woman, a little girl. In the sculptor's hand, a paintbrush dipped in gold, giving the freshly fired figure in front of him her blonde hair by the light of the open kiln. Corey Parker was a good boy of just 6 years old. He always did his chores and played nicely with the other kids on a suburban street. Corey was in a state of joyfulness. You see, it was Christmas Eve, and he was sure he had earned a place in the nice list. Still, even the best little boys misbehave a little. When it was time for bed, Cody let himself be tucked in by his mom and dad, and feigned sleep until he was certain that they were asleep themselves. He then tiptoed downstairs and sat on the living room couch by the tree. He was going to meet Santa Claus for himself. He hoped Santa would forgive him. He just wanted to show him the cookies that he had helped bake himself. The milk and cookies were still there, and there were no presents under the tree. Corey sighed with relief as he realized that he hadn't missed Santa. He sat on the couch for what felt like a lifetime, but was really less than an hour. He kept his eyes trained on the large fireplace adorned with stockings, just ready to be filled with goodies. He had almost drifted off to sleep when he heard the tapping. He jumped up and looked into the chimney, but didn't see anything. The tapping continued, and he realized that it wasn't coming from the chimney, but from the front window. Timidly, Corey walked up to the window and peered into the night. His eyes filled up with amazement. Standing at the window was Santa Claus. He was tall, with rosy cheeks and a big white beard. Over his shoulder was a red sack filled with who knows what kind of treasures. "Santa!" Corey exclaimed. "It's me, Corey. I'm sorry I didn't stay in bed, but I had to meet you. Please forgive me." "Ho, ho, ho. Why, of course, Corey. Santa could never be mad at you. Say, why don't you open the door and let me in? My elves have worked hard on your gifts," he said with a shuffle of his bag. Corey nodded and smiled. He walked up to the door cheerfully and was just about to open it when a nagging feeling stopped him. Corey's mom had always said that when he had a bad feeling, it was his guardian angel telling him that something was wrong. "Santa," Corey said through the door, "why didn't you come down the chimney?" Something felt wrong about this. Oh, it's a long story, Cody. I'll tell you when I get inside. Corey felt his stomach drop. Had Santa just called him Cody? The real Santa would never get his name wrong. He had an idea. Santa? He asked. Did you bring me the Hot Wheels set that I asked for? Corey waited with bated breath. Why, of course I did. Let me in so I can give it to you. Corey felt sick. If this was the real Santa, then he would know that Corey had asked for roller skates for Christmas. Whoever this was, it wasn't Santa. Corey slowly backed away from the door before running up to his room. All the while he ignored the man calling out to him. He ran into bed and buried himself deep into the covers and squeezed his eyes shut. He stayed that way until he fell asleep. The next morning, Corey awoke to the sound of sirens on his street. He ignored the gifts piled high under the tree and ran to his parents, who were looking out of the window in horror. When they noticed him, they shut the blinds and put on fake smiles, but Corey could tell that they were shaken. They never let him see the mutilated bodies of the Stevenson family lying in a neat row across their lawn. The next week, the police held a conference to discuss the case. Everyone in the house had been murdered, including Corey's friend Billy. What baffled the police was that there was no forced entry into the house. It was almost as if someone had just let the killer in. I'm an exterminator. I do the dirty job that no one else wants to. The average day is pretty routine, one might say pretty boring. I consider myself quite the expert and can get rid of most problems without breaking a sweat. As an exterminator, I am used to working odd hours and in some uncomfortable spaces. Let's just say what I encountered that day was much more than I could handle. I showed up to a property where the homeowner was complaining about thumping noises and scratching in the walls. Typically, these are signs of rodent infestations in the attic. Rodents gain access through the roof, vents, and stuff. The homeowners were not home, but they left entry instructions in the notes. Pretty basic home. I conduct a visual inspection, looking for droppings and such as I walk around the interior of the home. Nothing out of the ordinary. The next stop is the attic. I gain access to the attic using the pull-down ladder. Immediately, I am hit with the rush of cool air. Being that this is late November, that's not uncommon that the attic is colder than the rest of the house. I notice that there are a few traps that the homeowner has placed there. Most people try to deal with it before they call the expert. This attic is dark and freezing. I switch on my headlamp and start the inspection. There are droppings and chewed up insulation, along with rodent trails as I venture deeper. I place baited traps as I crawl deeper into this dark attic with only my headlamp to guide me. That is when I find the first rat. It is not strange to find a dead rat now and then, except this rat is bone dry, not a drop of blood or bloated. No flies or maggots, just a dried up rat. I push it in a trash bag and venture deeper. As I do, I run into more dead rats. Surely, these are not the rats that are disturbing the home. The deeper I crawl, the more rats I find, and in higher numbers. One thing I forgot to mention is that I usually have AirPods in listening to my daily podcasts, as this job can get lonely. The podcast ended as I got near the end of the attic. That's when I heard it. The sound of something moving, something way too big to be a rat. I looked up and saw what I could only describe as a beast, a second of what I can only describe as a thing from hell itself. An elongated face as of a dog and eyes of a predator. I back crawled as fast as I could, somehow rolling on my back and turning around. I do not know how I was able to make my way back to the entry point in such a rush, but I dropped down to the attic entry. I felt a crunch in my upper shoulder and a jolt of pain. I stood up, and using my good arm, I slammed the attic ladder up. I ran all the way back to my truck and called my boss. Not wanting to sound crazy, I told him I felt sick and needed to go home. I returned to work the next morning. My boss called me to his office. He asked if I was feeling better, and I confirmed that I was. He then proceeded to ask me if I knew where my coworker Jeff was, because he took over my job after I went home sick. He never returned the work van and never clocked out. I am posting this as I sit outside the home that I ran away from. My coworker's van is still outside. Hey friends, thanks for joining me today for Horror Time Story Time. If you liked the video, go ahead and give me a thumbs up down below. Leave a comment if you have any suggestions for stories that you want to see or hear coming up in part 4. That will be coming out next Friday, so be on the lookout for that. Thanks again for joining me, and I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I will catch you in the next video. Have a good one.